All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kimberlyn Elliott, and I'm the Assistant Director here at the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for our first installment in our Civil War to Civil Rights, a Lincolnville Saga series. So today our title is Watch Night, Looking to Freedom. So it's all about kind of the tradition of Watch Night and the Emancipation Proclamation and what happened with that here in St. Augustine and its reading, and then also across the nation. So today our talk will be facilitated by our Executive Director, Ms. Regina Gayle Phillips, who I'll have on in just a moment. And it'll be a brief presentation, and then we'll have room for question and answer at the end. So at the bottom of your screen, if you're not familiar with Zoom, you should see a little Q&A box where you can drop questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll circle back at the end and reserve some time to answer them. So once again, I'd like to welcome you and thank you so much for joining us. I hope you find it as illuminating and fun as it was for us to put it together. And without further ado, I'll have Gayle on right now.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Kimberlyn, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our first in a series of talks entitled Civil War to Civil Rights in St. Augustine. This series is a part of an ongoing project that we have with several museums throughout the St. Augustine area. Some are museums, some are institutions of higher learning, and we will all be bringing programming throughout the year that relates to African American history. But the program that we're going to start with today is called Watch Night, Looking to Freedom. And just give me 1 second here. Okay, and the purpose of this program is to give you a little background about what Watch Night services were about, why they were important, why they continued for so many years, and what we have to look forward to in the future. So Watch Night itself was a program that started in churches as an answer to prayer, to be honest. And it was African Americans, some free, some enslaved, who were praying for the freedom for all Black people who had been enslaved in America. So by the time we get to where we are today, as we lead into that, you'll see a little more of that unfold about how they look to the emancipation as an answer to prayer. So that's a kind of a brief overview of what we have. But I mentioned that we will also be doing programs throughout the year with other institutions in St. Augustine entitled Resilience, Black History in St. Augustine, or Black Heritage in St. Augustine. And that's going to be a 365-day program, not something every single day, but throughout the year 2021, various museums and institutions in the Northeast Florida area will present programs on Black heritage in the St. Augustine area so that we can bring you more of that story that really has a great national appeal to it, but often is left out of the national narrative as it relates to African Americans. So our hope is to bring you more of that. These conversations that we've had that led up to this have caused us to collaborate, and this is a program we present. You'll see this emblem, the logo. There's a website that you can go to that has programs. It has a calendar attached to it. We'll eventually have a archive that will be attached to it, an Omeka site that various museums can upload information. So you'll be able to go there as a source of information for institutions throughout the St. Augustine area. So we're really looking forward to this inaugural year of that program, and hopefully it will grow into something that will be a little more permanent for how we present our city's history of African American heritage. So our program today actually is going to primarily stick to the Lincolnville story. And I say that in the sense that we are the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center. And we are in the heart of Lincolnville. Lincolnville is an area that began in 1866 with the return of U.S. colored troops coming back from the Civil War. and they established an area that was first called Little Africa. It's in the southeastern section of the St. Augustine downtown area, just a few blocks from the historic districts of downtown St. Augustine. The area you see highlighted between the San Sebastian River and the Maria Sanchez Creek was known as Lincolnville. So today we are still here in Lincolnville as one of the institutions here in the historic Excelsior High School building, which was built much later in the 1920s for African-American students. So that's where the museum is today. That's where we're coming to you from this afternoon. That's where we hope you'll return when we are free from our COVID-19 pandemic and we're free to have live programs here in the museum once again. But we also have at the gateway into Lincolnville at the corner of Bridge Street and Martin Luther King Avenue, a historic marker of Lincolnville. And that marker will tell you more about the history of Lincolnville itself. The marker talks about how there were Blacks in the city of St. Augustine going back to the 16th century. And we know as early as 1565, when the city actually was established, that there were Blacks here. There were Blacks here prior to that time as well. But for today, we're going to stick to the period of our topic, which is from the Civil War through civil rights, with today's focus being on that period just immediately before the official signing of the Proclamation for Emancipation, which was December 31st, 1862, and January 1st, 1863. So we want to be able to continue to tell you that Lincolnville as a historic district is an area that we're going to use to frame most of our stories that we share today and the contributions of the people and places that contributed to that historic narrative of building this community and helping to build this nation. So the proclamation was issued by President Abraham Lincoln, and that proclamation was seen as a promise to freedom. If we could go to the next slide, thank you. The proclamation was seen as a promise because it promised freedom. Now, of course, we know it didn't deliver all of that, but it did promise freedom to the people who heard it being read to them if they were fortunate enough to be in one of those areas where they could hear it. And so that became a motivating factor for many people of African descent, free and enslaved, to join the ranks of and remember, we're talking about people from this particular area, to join the ranks of the South Carolina Volunteers. So men were recruited based on the promise of emancipation, and they joined the fight. They went off. Some were killed before the emancipation was even signed, but it was an opportunity for them to become soldiers in this war for freedom, not just for themselves, but for all people of color that have been enslaved as a part of the chattel slavery system in the country. So that motivation took them mainly to a place called Port Royal in South Carolina. So we'll go back and forth between Port Royal, which is Camp Saxon, which is today, we know it is Beaufort, Hilton Head area. And we'll go back and forth between there because the 34th and 33rd U.S. colored troops were mainly from St. Augustine. That's the area where they landed as part of the Union Army. Now they fought in other battles, other places, but that was their base camp. So today's talk will primarily be about the events leading to that first watch night meeting that took place locally in St. Augustine and other places that were under Union control. Those places were places that were a part by that time of the Confederacy. I want to make that clear, but they were under Union control because not even all of the states that were a part of the Union at that time had all where all the people were free. They had some people who were free and some people who were still enslaved in some of those other states that were known as free states as well. So we are going to take you to the Camp Saxon for the signing or the waiting or watch night, watching for freedom to come, watching for that signing of the emancipation. And some of the things I want to make sure that I point out to you is that believers congregated in churches throughout the nation, especially in the free areas, to look for that. There was an answer to prayers. But people in areas that were still under slavery, they snuck away to gather under, trees or in the woods or wherever they could to see if they got any word or any sign of Union soldiers coming through saying that the emancipation had been signed. So that's a little bit of the tradition of how it came to be. The map that you're seeing is showing East Florida and West Florida, and St. Augustine obviously is a part of East Florida. We are on the southeast seaboard of America, and most of that corridor that goes from Florida up to the North Carolinas was a part, at that time, was under Confederacy. Those are states that had joined the Confederacy, but they also had pockets within those states where Union was in control. And Camp Saxon, which was 2 states up in South Carolina, was one of those places where people from St. Augustine, as well as some Jacksonville and Fernandina Beach people or Amelia Island became a part of those camps there. So we're going to move towards emancipation. And as we do that, we want to show you some of the things that happened here locally leading up to that. So on January 7th, 1861, Marion, which is our Castillo de San Marco, was handed over without a fight to Confederate soldiers who got the key from this soldier that was in charge. And, he freely gave it over without a fight. And the Confederacy took over the fort. They were planning to use it as a source for ammunitions. As a matter of fact, I think a couple of the guns were taken, cannons were removed from there during that time. But the Confederacy has not formally formed at that time. That's local initiative that people took. So by January 10th, Florida officially becomes the 3rd state to help form the Confederate States of America. Now, I want you to also keep in mind that prior to January of 1861 was November of 1860. That's when President Lincoln was elected as President of the United States. He has not been inaugurated yet. But by March 10th, a year later, 14 months later, the fort is given back to the Union Army because the Confederate troops who were there, they abandoned it on news that a flotilla of Union Navy is approaching from Mayport area and that they're going to retake this fort. So rather than stay and fight, they flee and go inland into other places, leaving St. Augustine to the Union to occupy for the duration of the war. On September 22nd, 1862, President Lincoln's draft of the Emancipation is read throughout Union-controlled areas as well as in St. Augustine. And it was read locally here in churches and in other places where the Union soldiers had control. And it was used as a recruitment for Blacks to join the Union Army. And so by November of 62, we see Blacks being recruited and actually joining forces with the Union Army or with the South Carolina Volunteers. By December 31st, 1862, when we are looking at this first watch night service leading to the emancipation, various places are holding those secret meetings and some public meetings in the areas where it was possible to talk about what we're looking for. We're looking for the emancipation or manumission of Blacks who have been enslaved. In Carolina, a lot of the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor, the people would say manumission night. So that was something that was and continues to be celebrated even to this day within that corridor that goes from North Carolina down to St. Johns County, Florida, where we're located. But we know that the Union was already here in St. Augustine at that time, so it would have been celebrated here. This is an illustration from Frank Leslie of Union soldiers occupying the plaza here, Plaza de la Constitución, downtown St. Augustine in 1862, that they held drills and stuff there. Now that's the same plaza where the Confederates had held their drills prior to the Union coming in and retaking the city for the Union as part of the Union. So all of that was going on here. So by the time we get to January 1st, 1863, we already have the Union Army has been here for a good while. And so the Emancipation was officially read first at the U.S. Governor's Provost House, which we know today as the Government House. And it was also read at other locations, which we'll share a little bit with you in a moment. But these areas would definitely have been a part of what we saw. Putnam County, some parts, not totally, but Nassau, Duval, St. John's, and parts of Baker, which is just east of Jacksonville, areas that were primarily under Union control. Some not continually, like St. Augustine was, but under Union control at that particular moment in time. So on January 12th, 1863, we go back to Camp Saxon, and we see the conveyance of the flags or the colors to Union Army, which were presented to the two highest ranking Black soldiers at that camp at that time. Most of the celebrations that we see throughout the historical journals are from Camp Saxon, of mainly from General Higginson, who was in command of the soldiers at that particular point in time, who created a grand celebration leading up to the emancipation. You know, the notes say that he ordered for 10 oxen to be killed and readied for barbecue, and that they barbecued 7 and saved 3 to fatten for a later date because they were so scrawny, because, you know, you've been in a war for over a year and a half now, and, you know, their grazing places are scarce. There's also, you know, mention of creating a drink made with molasses and water and having that as part of the refreshments that were offered in the camp that day. Also in the camp were people of all kinds, people who came in from different locations. You had freedmen who may have been there, but you had soldiers, Black and white. Some brought their wives, some of the other people came there, and it was a big celebration. So at the reading of the Emancipation, you see celebrations break out spontaneously with the singing of My Country 'Tis of Thee by Black men, joined in by Black women, and it becomes almost like an anthem at the time, because for the first time they're able to sing about a country that they can claim as their own, and flags that they can claim as their own. In May of that same year, I'm sorry, not that year, but 2 years later, in 1865, the Civil War ends. So that's a long time between the reading of the Emancipation in St. Augustine and the reading of the Emancipation as it gets to the places on the western parts of our state and the western parts of our country, known as Emancipation Day in Tallahassee, which is May 20th, 1865, when General Cook makes his way and reads it at the Knott House. And then we have June 19th in 1865, when General Granger reads the proclamation in Texas. And that date is known as Juneteenth, which is a combination of the month and the date. And a lot of people say that is the actual Emancipation Day. And then others will say actually emancipation comes much, much later with the passing of the 13th Amendment, which is years before it's actually passed. And some people will say it didn't happen until the 1960s when the Civil Rights Act was passed. And some people will say it still hasn't happened. So we want to focus on Watch Night and give you a little bit more history about what that meant to the people at that point in time. This portrait that you see before you was actually presented to President Abraham Lincoln following the emancipation. And it is said to be one of the few things that his widow took with her when she left the White House after his assassination. Now, this picture, we're going to share a little bit more with you about that, but it became one of the favorites of President Barack Obama. So we're going to go now to a little bit of a video from White House archivist who's going to tell you some of the meaning of the symbolism that's in this portrait.
We're standing today in the West Wing. This is the vestibule outside of the cabinet room and the Oval Office. The painting that we're interested in today is hanging over my shoulder. It's William Carleton's 1863 painting called Watch Meeting, December 31st, 1862, Waiting for the Hour. And it relates to the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Elements that were put in the painting to be symbolic. You have a white printed document mounted on the wall that says Proclamation of Emancipation and has the January 1st, 1863 date. They're looking at a watch. The group in the center are looking at a pocket watch that has a fob that's a little anchor, the traditional symbol of hope. Other hopeful signs, a cross in the far left to represent the hope of religion, the American flag, the hope of the political availability. And then the artist created the title across the bottom here with groups of words being painted on links of a chain, with the idea that the chain now is broken because it ends at each end, and so it's no longer holding down the people depicted in the painting, but it's been a liberating moment for them. The Emancipation Proclamation is especially important as we're now celebrating Black History Month. It was not freedom for all slaves in America, but freedom in the areas of the South that were still in rebellion against the federal government. So it wasn't an all-comprehensive approach to emancipation. That would actually take place with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. It's a story painting that has an interesting history for the Emancipation Proclamation subject and was, for a long time, hung in the Lincoln bedroom, but we brought it over here when President Obama expressed an interest in paintings that tell great stories. And so this was a nice location right outside his office to have this painting that's only been in the White House collection since the mid-1970s, but the image itself had a previous White House history back in the Lincoln administration.
So I gave you a little bit of a background of what Watch Night meant over history, what the symbols in that painting mean. And I would also like to tell you that African Americans, they weren't just watching for the signing of the emancipation, but there was something a little deeper that they were watching for, and that was the opportunity to fight for freedom. Because we know that if it had not been for the U.S. colored troops, in most cases, according to war documents, many of those conflicts would not have been won against the Confederacy at that time. So they were really fighting for their own freedom. A lot of them, with that promise of emancipation, were able to just flee to plantations and find ways to seek out the Union soldiers who they heard were in their area and become soldiers and take up arms and fight against the enemy that was the Confederacy that was wanting to prolong the institution of slavery in America. So by the time we get to January 1st, 1863, the proclamation is read again publicly. And it says that on that first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be thenceforward and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons and will do acts to repress such persons or any of them, any effort they may make for their actual freedom. So as that states, it's like, if these people may act towards their own freedom, the US government was not going to suppress that. So that leads back to some other things we'll talk about in some upcoming things like the Confiscation Act and the use of contraband, which is what they were called as fighting forces against the Confederacy. So those are some of the things that people look into. It wasn't that it provided freedom for everybody, but it was a vehicle to freedom for many. And so this is a picture of Government House that goes back to 1864. The Government House is on the corner of King Street and St. George's Street here in downtown St. Augustine. It's now known as the Government House, but that was the United States Provost Guard House, which is where the Emancipation, that proclamation or executive order was actually read. Excuse me. Another place that it was read was a lot inside of a plantation here in St. Augustine. And we get this from a record that comes much later in our history. But this reads that it says, during the Civil War, St. Augustine fell into Union hands in March of 1862. On January of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was officially issued in Florida at this location. This action freed all slaves in Florida. Former St. Augustine slave Mary Gomez reported that when word of the Emancipation Proclamation reached the city, all slaveholders were ordered to release their slaves and allow them to gather in a large vacant lot at this location. The slaves were freed during the reading, and the bonds of the slaves, including Mary Gomez, were struck off. So now this is now on private property that's been renovated in St. Augustine, but this is still a part of our local heritage history that's here in St. Augustine that we wanted to share with you. The celebrations at Camp Saxon, as I mentioned earlier, they were grand. I mean, they had bands, they had all kinds of things that were going on, speeches from different people. And the most prolific thing that everybody keeps repeating is the spontaneous singing of My Country, 'Tis of Thee, Sweet Land of Liberty, of Thee I Sing. And that became like what was remarkable from both soldiers, from teachers who had come down, from freedmen, and even there were some Black teachers who had come to South Carolina. There were enslaved women who were part of the audience there that day. They all recount that moment as one of the most significant in the celebration that day. And those celebrations continue, not just in Camp Saxon in that area, but throughout the corridor, throughout that, what we know now as the Gullah Geechee corridor, and here in St. Augustine. The very next year, this is an invitation from a freedman who was head of the committee. His name was Monroe Robinson, and he's inviting a Captain Dugan of the 7th New Hampshire Volunteers to the anniversary of the proclamation Emancipation in St. Augustine for January 1st, 1864. So we know that the celebrations here started as early as January. We know they started in 63, but they were repeated as early as 64 with a formal invitation for a program and dinner. And also throughout, like I said, throughout the corridor, as well as places like Charleston and other areas, they continued. So this is a picture from Charleston, another illustration from Frank Leslie. A lot of what we have is from Leslie's illustrations from newspapers. And this was in January of 1877. So you see different people, even though the war has been over for a while, that there's still this pride. And even you see this Black fireman in the center of the picture, that's one of the professions that is noted that a lot of former USCTs took up. And it became a big part of what they carried forth with them. Some are still dressed in their uniforms as soldiers. But the parades, by that time, the Grand Army of the Republic is established. And so you have like these large parades that are going on throughout the South and as well as in other areas of the country. In St. Augustine, we formed what was called emancipation committees, and they were the ones that helped to organize the parades throughout time. So we're able to capture a lot of the history through the photographs of a Lincolnville resident. His name was Richard A. Twine, and we have a few of his works here in the museum. And this is one that was actually published in a book on Frank Butler, who is shown here as the kind of tall, handsome guy in the back row near the center that was an entrepreneur who also helped to organize the businessmen and women of St. Augustine. Now, this was taken in the 1920s. That's some 60 years after the emancipation is issued. So we know the parades continued at least until that time, because these are the last documented records that we have so far. We'll continue to dig, and when we find more things, we'll be happy to share those with you as well. But Richard Twine, through his photographs, captured a lot of the parades that happen here. And those parades show the floats. Here's the Grand Army of the Republic leading the parade, and as the parade marshals, that this picture, for example, is shown in so many places, and it gets no credit to Richard Twine in a lot of the instances where I've seen it used, but we know it belongs to him because the original glass slides that Richard Twine used for his photography, they were salvaged from a home that was going to be destroyed, and those negatives were taken to our local St. Augustine Historical Society that still has those original negatives that these prints are made from. And so other people have, appropriated them. And I've even heard somebody say this was in Chicago. I mean, it's right here in St. Augustine on Marine Street. And it would have been the parade route that would have gone from Louisville up through downtown St. Augustine. And there were bands, there were people who came out to follow the parade. There were all kinds of floats, but there were always, military and the flags, and it was always a part of it. And these organizations, the Grand Army of the Republic, they had both black and white divisions at that time. They also were the ones who were like the forerunners of creating what's known as Memorial Days. And so they established that. They had floats that were part of it from, this one is from St. Paul's AME Church Usher Board. This is a medical auxiliary that has some of the local doctors and nurses from the Lincolnville area who decorated their car and joined in the parade. And we have floats from schools like St. Benedict de Moor School with their children. And these are the Knights of Pythias, who were also marchers in the parade. That was a benevolent organization that came through the church. And so these were a big part of what was here. They had different queens in court and, businesses that participated. We had all kinds of other floats that were a part of the parade. We just wanted to share a few of those with you. This would have been at Louisville, where they would congregate and have celebrations there as well. And then the parade would start in this location. So Twine is really responsible for us having a lot of the history captured. This is from an insurance company, most likely African American Life Insurance Company, and it also had another realtor who was a sponsor. So you see the house that's on this float representing their businesses. But Richard Twine captured a lot of these, and they are still being studied and mapped to see the people who were in there, the people, the places, and all those things that help to tell the stories of Lincolnville and how they relate to the history of emancipation and watch night services here And we are just happy to bring you this program, to be able to share these photographs with you and share this history. Like I said, we will be sharing many other segments as we go forward. And at this time, I think I'm going to go back to Kimberlyn. Oh, before I do this, I do want to say thank you to a few people who were very instrumental in helping us to put this program together. And that was, Michael Konopacki. Mike is a graphic designer, and he has helped us unselfishly to design many of the slides that you see here, as well as other exhibits that we have here in the museum. I had a wonderful intern this semester, Alexis Andino, who did a lot of the research for us. And I want to commend her for a job well done. I'm getting technical assistance today from Ms. Caroline Davis, who is also on our team, and my assistant editor, Kimberlyn Elliott, who is priceless in terms of her contributions that she's made, not just to this project, but to the museum since she's been here. So thank you all. And some of the other sources are listed here that we use. I hope you will go to our website and look at some of those so you can get more in-depth details about some of the stories that we saw. We can't share everything with you here, but we do hope that you will visit our website and get more information about not just this, but other programs that we're doing at Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center. So I'm going to go back to Kimberlyn now.
All right. Well, thank you, Gayle. I've been getting some really nice comments. People saying that they're appreciating it, putting this on, and we really appreciate you all joining us today for this program. It's been really fun to put together and fun to kind of sit and watch and put together in the background. So now let's see, we have a couple questions that we will get to. This one comes from Ahmed, and he said, or they said rather, after over 150 years of the Proclamation of Emancipation of Slavery, we observe traces of slavery and discrimination in the USA. How does the museum reach out to the public and the government not to repeat this dark period of the nation's history to the vulnerable minority group of this society? Good question. I'll kind of start and then you can tag me. But really, I would say one of our main contributions is this type of activity, kind of explaining in more detail and more depth how Black history is fundamental to the history of this entire nation. I think that oftentimes if you are only exposed to Black history through school, if you come up through the K through 12 system, it's very kind of scattered. It's not uniform. So there may be things that you never hear about that occurred even in your backyard. So kind of creating this idea of local awareness of history and how your local history is replicated on a national scale, and just seeing how those two things interplay. And just by facilitating conversation in the museum, if you ever come in and catch one of us at the front desk, we'll probably have at least a 15-minute conversation with you about something in here, because that's truly what we enjoy, taking something that's on the wall, an image or a text box or something, and having it not just be something static, but something that you can talk about and interact and trace the changes over time. So that's kind of what I would say.
No, that's good. I absolutely agree. I would also say that, I have to remind people we are not a social activist kind of agency. We are a museum. So what we do is to share the history. And one of my favorite quotes is from Dr. King. It says, "We don't make history, history makes us." So if we continue to learn that history and learn from that history, then we are not apt to repeat it. And so we will continue to do that as well whenever we have the opportunity to share the stories. And, when we have time to dig into the archives and find stuff like this that we can share. So thank you.
Awesome. We have another question from Jasmine, who says, if we are interested in doing research at your museum and archives, how do we arrange that? Send us an email. That's the quick answer. Send us an email, tell us what you're researching, and we can look and see and start to organize things and let you know what we can help you with. All right, let's see if we have something else. Let's see. Elizabeth says, I may have missed it, but how involved was the Catholic Church and Sisters of St. Joseph in Lincolnville's Watch Night? Thanks again for this informative program.
That's a good question, which we don't have the direct answer to. We know that they were involved in the Emancipation parades. As you see, St. Benedict the Moore School was involved, and the church most likely was involved because it was a St. Benedict the Moore weekend as a matter of fact, let me just step back a little bit. St. Benedict the Moore came really actually later. It wouldn't have been there during that original watch night. It didn't come online until sometime later that the church actually started, because the church at that point, Blacks were still meeting in the cathedral downtown. St. Benedict the Moore Church came later, and it was built as a mission church for the community of Lincolnville. So it did not exist at that original time of the original watch night service. So we will be bringing you more from St. Joseph's and the Sisters of St. Joseph's, they've got tons of history that they want to share with us. And as we continue through this series, you'll see more about some of the other people who were involved in the establishment of, Lincolnville, Reconstruction era Lincolnville, and the other topics. We will be able to bring you more from some of those people who will share directly with you some of the history from their archives as well. So thank you for the question.
So Max says, as a result of the protests this summer, the Lincoln statue in Boston was taken down recently. The original in DC is still in place, but may still be taken down. Is there any discussion about changing the name of Lincolnville? Thank you for a superb program. We're following you now. Happy New Year. Happy New Year, Max.
So I think that Lincolnville, I don't have the answer to that. I don't think that there's any plan to change that name. I think it was named Lincolnville as an honor to President Lincoln because of the emancipation. And so I'm not seeing, I don't think that we can say every single person that participated in the act of slavery should be obliterated from history. A lot of the monuments were removed because the stories that were told were not accurate in terms of how they related to the history of the Civil War, that they omitted the fact that it was over slavery, when every document that I've read, including the Constitution of the Confederate States of America, says that it was over the issue of slavery. And so I appreciate your question. I don't know if that answers you, but I haven't heard any discussion about changing the name.
I haven't heard anything either. Let's get back to the questions. Let's see. We have one that says, Debbie says, please re-clarify watch nights in the church. Don't completely understand it.
Okay. So watch night was... the churches were praying, the parishioners were praying for freedom. I mean, obviously, if you go to church, you're praying, even in just the spiritual context, you're praying for deliverance. And so in the context of enslaved people, they were praying for deliverance for, some of them were free, but they were praying for the freedom of their brethren who were still enslaved. So I'm going to read a little bit for you. That it says that the believers congregated in churches in the north and around praying trees in secret locations in the south on the evening of December 31st, 1862, to watch for the coming of the Emancipation Proclamation, evidence that God had heard their cries. Thus, the tradition of watch night was born. That's why it was born. And if in the context of the Civil War, it means that now we have a chance to go. We have to remember that Blacks were not allowed to fight for their freedom in the Civil War, even though they had fought in pretty much every conflict in American history. But they were not allowed to engage as soldiers for fight for their own freedom up until that issuance of the proclamation made it official that now the Union is going to sanction us going out and fighting for our freedom. What they did before was, they went away, and if they were able to stay free, they did. And sometimes they were captured and brought back, or killed and beaten, and all kinds of other things that happened to them that were not pleasant. But the significance of it in the church is to commemorate that this is a time when people who weren't free were able to break free and break for their own freedom. Now, as I grew up going to church, we had watch night meetings. I had no idea that it was related to this. I just thought we were waiting for the new year to come. And, you got the watchman in the east, and the watchman in the west, and the watchman in the south, and they would call out the time. But nobody really explained that it was a part of a tradition that went back 150 years. Well, this would have been 50 years ago. So I'm dating myself, but nobody explained that to me as a child or as an adult. And I've gone to watch night services a lot of times. So the meaning was, we're watching for something significant to happen. And I think that part of it remained without a lot of history about what was it we were looking for to happen. It got transitioned into, we're waiting for the return of the Lord, I think, over time.
Yeah, I would agree. And as you mentioned, it has kind of roots in the Moravian church. So there's kind of like this parallel system of the more singularly religious kind of practice of watch night, and then it gaining this historical perspective as well, specifically with Black churches and in the African American community. All right.
Yeah, because they were watch night before, but through the Calvinist church, they had watch night. Right. So it goes way back in history.
Right. It's just a separate connotation, I would say. All right. Our friend, Mr. Thomas Jackson, asked, how long was St. Augustine under Confederate control? And I'll take that one. So the garrison, the Florida militia, gets control of the fort in January 7th, 1861. And then 3 days later, Florida secedes and is now a Confederate state. So from January 10th, and then the Union arrives in March of 1862. So a year and 3 months, give or take. And then once St. Augustine was claimed for the Union, it did not fall back into Confederate hands for the rest of the the rest of the war.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Jasmine says, in response to Max's question about the Lincoln statue and Lincolnville's name changing, she says, the Lincoln statues mentioned also have very specific reasons about why they were being removed. There's a positioning of a Black man as subservient to Lincoln in that statue. So that context kind of changes.
Right, yeah. So it was that presentation of it, yeah.
Yes, we will be posting the PowerPoint really via recording of this whole program. So it'll be on our website and our YouTube channel. And I will send a link to all of you people who participated and joined us as soon as we get that up. So our friend asks again, since watch night has been and rather become more church related, what denomination took the lead in the event? And this I don't really have an answer to. I think, at least in my experience, I've seen watch night be across multiple denominations. I know, I grew up, my parents' family goes to a Baptist church in Ocala, so we celebrated it there. But then I was personally raised in a non-denominational church, and we also celebrated it. So, do you have any insight into that, Gayle?
Well, I think the same here. From my personal experience, I've gone to AME churches and Baptist churches and non-denominational churches, and they've all had watch night services. And, the churches, I know one of the big churches that still celebrates is Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And a lot of the churches in that region, but I don't think it was a specific church that it was more like a cultural thing that went over any kind of specific religious sect to be almost like a day of jubilee for anybody. It didn't matter which church you belong to, and you have to remember that in the South especially, there were not a lot of churches for African Americans at that point in time. They may have had some itinerant preachers that got loaned from plantation to plantation to go and, indoctrinate enslaved people into Christianity, but they did not have big churches like what we have today. Most of those denominations were born much later.
Let's see. So let me double check and make sure we've gotten to all our questions. So something that I personally kind of wanted to circle back to, because I think it's really interesting, is this idea of kind of the self-emancipation that was happening before the actual proclamation was like widely spread. So I kind of wanted to talk to you more about that and this idea of kind of the approach of the Union Army. So like the Union Army itself being a emancipatory kind of jumping off point,
So that's a very controversial subject in terms of history, because not everybody in the Union Army was for freeing the slaves.
Right.
I think that and there are also some incidences where Blacks joined the Confederate Army at some point in time, and then when they had the opportunity, they switched over. But the idea of self-emancipation is that people, when they heard about this emancipation or rumors about this emancipation, they left the plantations. And the plantation owners, they were upset because now they're losing revenue. They're losing their source of income, and they talk about it freely. And a lot of the publications that we reviewed, that they talk about how they don't have anybody to harvest their crops for that season because now they're going off to war. And then you also hear stories about the Union Army who make derogatory statements about the Blacks that are following them, including Sherman, who is like, he didn't know what to do with them. It's like, he becomes like this Pied Piper as he's marching across the South and people are just following him. That's how you had such a large gathering at Fort Saxon. There's also stories about how one soldier commented that if we keep, if they keep following us, then they're going to become, it's going to be like every man's going to have his own porter, so they still saw Blacks as a subservient class. But it was General Butler, I believe, at Fort Monroe, who came up with the idea of the Confiscation Act, or the first Confiscation Act. And he's saying like, okay, if these people leave, that they become contraband, and we're going to take the contraband as long as we can use them to fight against the enemy, and we're going to use them in our military forces. So there was dissension within the Union ranks, including from President Lincoln, about that. Eventually he comes around and that becomes a part of what is used, but there's still a lot of controversy. The whole issue, if you look at the draft riots of 1863 in New York, it's because white soldiers don't want to go and fight for the freedom of enslaved people in the South. Not everybody is in agreement with that. So even the soldiers themselves, they were not all given weapons. There's some officers who say we don't want them to have weapons, and some say we gotta give them weapons. And eventually they come around to where they are given weapons to the point that at some point in the war, they're going from being enslaved one day and a runaway and getting a musket, later the same day because they need the forces. There's one comment in here that I would like to read, and I think it's a quote, and this is from the African American Civil War Museum, a museum of the Civil War, and this is from President Lincoln, and he's talking about the need for these Black soldiers. It wasn't because we just want you and we love you and, we want everybody to come and have kumbaya. He says, I know as fully as one can know the opinions of others that some of the commanders of our armies in the field who have given us our most important successes, believe the emancipation policy and the use of control of colored troops contribute the heaviest blow yet dealt to the rebellion, and that at least one of those important successes could not have been achieved when it was but for the aid of Black soldiers. Among commanders holding these views are some who have never had any opinion or any affinity with what's called abolitionism or with Republican Party politics, but who hold them purely as military opinions. And so he was fixed on the opinion that persons of African descent were needed militarily to save the Union. So they freed themselves, but they also saved the Union.
Awesome. I think that's an important distinction to make. Kind of the more that you study the Civil War, you see how much of at least the kind of political and government response, and militarily as well, it's all based on timing and what had last happened and the momentum and seeing the political gain of making certain decisions versus the political costs. So we'll get more into that in our next ones. Don't you worry.
Yes, we will.
I think we've gotten to all of our questions, so I guess we can head on out. If nobody else has anything else, thank you all so much for joining us. As you can see, we're both smiling. It's been fun. You all have had some wonderful questions. We'll make sure this is posted and sent out so everyone can see it, and you can share it with people who might not have been able to join us today. Also, please, I will be sending you a survey link, if not tomorrow, sometime in the next couple days. So if you could please respond and let us know kind of your feedback. Since this is going to be a series with multiple parts, we want to make it as great as possible. So we really would love just to hear from you and what you enjoyed and everything like that. Let's see. I think that is it. Oh, yes, one last thing. It is the end of the year. If you are just itching to finish your end of the year giving, the Lincolnville Museum and Cultural Center is always here to help. So with that, I would just like to say thank you all so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day and a very happy New Year. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Kimberlyn.